The subcommittee will come to order. At the conclusion of opening statements yesterday, the chair called up H.R. 1407 and offered an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Is there discussion of the amendment? The amendment in the nature of a substitute. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Chairman Putz. It's my understanding that the amendment in the nature of substitute has been offered, which combines 1407, which is the ADUFA bill, which 1408, which is the ADUFA, which is Cory Gardner's bill, and just puts them together, much to the chagrin of Cory, who wanted it to be our bill rolled into his, but that's the benefit of seniority around here, so he'll just have to wait his time. Reauthorizing animal drug user fees is a priority for my constituents and producers, veterinarians, drug sponsors, and pet owners across the country. It's been very successful. It's really, in essence, a basic reauthorization everybody's asking for, and with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Chair, thanks. The gentleman, is there any other discussion on the amendment? Are there bipartisan amendments to the amendment? Are there other amendments to the amendment? If there are no more amendments, if there are no more amendments, the vote occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 1407 to the full committee as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. All right. The chair now calls up the committee print and asks the clerk to report on the next bill.
Discussion draft to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act with respect to the pharmaceutical distribution supply chain and for other purposes. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any other amendments? Chair will recognize the gentlelady from Virgin Islands, Dr. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to discussion draft offered by Mrs. Christensen of Virgin Islands. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Pallone, as well. I'm offering this amendment because, as I highlighted during the April 25th hearing on this bill, I agree that altered, counterfeit, and substandard medication is an important issue for the FDA and this subcommittee to address. However, I'm offering this amendment to finally address a consequence that is likely not intended, and it's also not controversial. It's completely fixable. And the issue my amendment addresses is one that arises from a provision in the treaty that was signed in 1917 when the U.S. bought the U.S. Virgin Islands from Denmark. That provision, which decided that the U.S. Virgin Islands would be outside of the U.S. customs zone, was intended for our economic benefit. And while it's been beneficial, in recent years especially, it's created some serious problems. As a physician who's practiced for more than 20 years in the U.S. Virgin Islands before coming to Congress, I can assure you that, one, the U.S. Virgin Islands is a part of the United States. Our pharmacists, as well as our physicians, are trained and graduate from programs in the United States. Our pharmacies are regulated by United States law. Our pharmacists are licensed by the United States agencies where applicable. And our pharmacies and hospitals exclusively order medicines from known and reputable U.S. suppliers. But for that one provision, We are, in fact, totally domestic for everything except shipping. And because of this unique quirk, law-abiding pharmacies, including our hospital pharmacies in the U.S. Virgin Islands, cannot return expired, oversupplied, damaged, and other drugs back to the supplier in the states that they brought them from. As this body can imagine, it causes an economic drain to the pharmacies and creates some barriers to drug access for patients who need their prescriptions to treat especially rare illnesses, but also to manage ordinary symptoms, pain, conditions in order to live healthy, productive lives. We've been trying to get this issue addressed through several Congresses, and even Dr. Woodcock, who last week expressed support for fixing this issue. And just so to also be clear, this is not reimportation. We're not asking for special privileges, only the same benefits that pharmacies in the rest of the United States enjoy. And so I'm asking my colleagues on both sides of the aisle today to support this amendment to finally address and fix a problem that we should not be having in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And with that, I yield back.
The Chair thanks the gentlelady for raising this issue. From what I understand, this issue arises from a treaty that was signed in the year 1917 when the U.S. bought the U.S. Virgin Islands from Denmark. According to the gentlelady, the treaty dictated that the U.S. Virgin Islands would be outside of the U.S. customs zone. This is really the first that we've heard of the issue, and we need to do our due diligence, including reviewing the treaty and customs law, talking with the FDA, speaking to our colleagues on other committees. Based on what I've heard thus far, it seems to me that this bill is not the right vehicle for this issue, but that doesn't mean we can't find another one. And if the gentlelady withdraws the amendment, I'll commit to working with her on this issue so that we can see if we can work it out.
If the gentleman will yield
full committee chairman
for a moment, I just want to indicate that the two of us want to refer to a conversation that we had earlier this week. I think the gentlelady's amendment is a good one and one that makes common sense, and we ought to do it. The only question here is whether or not the parliamentarians will let us proceed here. And I'd like to take a little time, maybe between now and full committee, to talk to Dave Camp and just see where they are, and if we can't try to work this out between the two of us, and certainly make that commitment to try and get it done. But this is not until we have that conversation. We probably can't accept the amendment today.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Gentlelady recognized.
Am I recognized, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, I truly appreciate the words that have been offered by both the subcommittee chair and the chair of the larger committee, and I'm looking forward to working with both of you and Chairman Camp, and I withdraw the amendment at this time.
The lady withdraws the amendment. Now Chair recognize the ranking member, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to say that I'm sympathetic also to the concern that the gentlewoman raised, and so we'll all work together to try to resolve it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks, gentlemen. The chair now recognizes himself for the purpose of offering an amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to discussion draft offered by Mr. Pitts.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and I'll recognize myself 5 minutes in support of the amendment. This amendment would make a number of minor technical and conforming changes to the bill, such as defining quarantines regarding the illegitimate product process and ensuring that transaction histories and statements could be passed simultaneously with a transaction. The amendment would also ensure administrative actions could be used by states to enforce the licensure requirements of the Act. Is there discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The Ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
Do you have any more amendments?
Are there any more amendments?
I don't think there are any more amendments.
All right, we have a colloquy.
I'll move to strike the list. You want me to do the
Is Lance here? No, we don't have all of the people for the colloquy. The chair recognizes Mr. Pallone, Mr. Dingell, Mr. Lance for the purposes of a colloquy.
Mr. Chairman, it's not my intention for this topic to be part of the deliberations today, but I want to inform the subcommittee about current negotiations between the cosmetics industry and the FDA to improve regulatory requirements at a federal level for cosmetic products. I believe that it's so important that we ensure consumer confidence by updating these laws dating back to 1938. As soon as an agreement is reached, and I'm hopeful that there will be one, I intend to work in a bipartisan fashion to secure further consensus around the agreement by other stakeholders and members of this committee.
Gentlemen,
I yield to Mr. Dingell, yes.
I want to commend him for his participation in this matter. As the gentleman knows, I've been working closely with the cosmetic industry for many years to try and develop an enhanced regulatory framework. This is a good and a responsible industry which does seek responsible changes to enable them to do a better job. I understand that the industry fee structure has been part of the conversation to ensure that FDA has the necessary resources to implement regulatory improvements. I also want to encourage my committee colleagues to move expeditiously to pass legislation on this long overdue regulatory reform. I'd like to yield now to my colleague, Mr. Lance, who I believe has also been supportive of regulatory modernization for cosmetics. And if I'm able, I yield to him.
Chair recognizes Mr. Lance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Dingell. I'm pleased that both large and small companies have been meeting with the FDA on how best to put forth meaningful reforms and that a science-based national uniform standard, which would foster innovation, is being discussed. The cosmetics industry is an important employer across the country and certainly in New Jersey, and nationally employs 8.2 million people. I understand their concerns about the potential for conflicting state laws that impede their ability to provide products in a global marketplace. Mr. Dingell, I look forward to working with you and with you, Mr. Pallone, and other members of the committee to pass cosmetics legislation this year. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, reclaiming my time, I would simply yield back the remainder of my time.
I thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for your efforts to move cosmetics legislation through this committee. Legislation ensures national uniformity and regulatory certainty, will most certainly contribute to the promotion of innovation and the creation of new jobs. I want the committee to know that I look forward to discussing this issue with my colleagues. The question now occurs on forwarding the committee print to the full committee.
Mr. Chairman, I want to move to strike the last word.
Sorry, the chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, we have repeatedly heard loud and clear from the FDA, Pew, the National Boards of Pharmacy, and many others that if we want a secure drug supply chain, we need an electronic, interoperable, unit-level tracking system that can identify illegitimate product in real time so that it does not end up in patients' hands. We also heard repeatedly that creating this kind of system is doable and in the very near future. Unfortunately, the bill we're considering today does not actually require the establishment of an electronic, interoperable, unit-level system by a date certain. Instead, by 2027, 14 years from now, FDA will be required to issue proposed regulations that would, if finalized, establish such a system. And the bill would make the establishment of the interoperable electronic unit-level system entirely dependent on the issuance of final regulations by the FDA. But the bill never even sets a date by which the FDA would be required to finalize the regulations, so the proposed regulations could sit and linger for years before we ever see the final regulations. And on top of all this, the bill requires that there be yet another delay of 2 years in implementation after the final regulations are issued, if they ever are. These kinds of delays and uncertainty about whether we'll ever even see an electronic interoperable unit-level system are unnecessary. We can do better than this. In order for me to support any legislation moving forward, we must require FDA to establish this system based on the requirements in the statute. And this is not a new way to legislate, obviously. We do not need to require FDA to implement regulations as a precondition. In fact, in our 2007 drug safety legislation, this is exactly what we did. We gave FDA the authority to impose risk evaluation and mitigation systems, REMS, post-market safety studies, and to require label changes, all without requiring FDA to first promulgate regulations. We also all know the perils of rulemaking in general. Even if we were to require FDA to issue final regulations by a date certain, there is no guarantee that it will actually happen. Look at what has unfortunately happened with critical regulations for the food safety law we enacted in 2011. So, Mr. Chairman, we simply need to have the certainty of a date certain and a self-effectuating system. Even industry indicated at our hearing that a date certain will be critical. So I ask my colleagues, work with us now until we move on to full committee so that we can instead ensure a fully operational Unity level phase 2. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to strike the last word in order to echo Mr. Pallone's concerns, which I share, about the lack of a strong phase 2 in this bill. Let's be very clear about what this bill does and does not do. It gives us no assurance whatsoever that we ever get to an electronic interoperable unit-level tracking system. Never. It may happen, it may not. Instead, the bill only requires that no sooner than January 1, 2027, 14 years from now, FDA issue proposed regulations. And only if those regulations were finalized would we ever see such a system. The bill also fails to even set a deadline for when these proposed regulations would ever have to be finalized. What it does do, though, is require that FDA give an additional 2 years from the date the final regulations are issued, whenever that is, until they can become effective. So at the very least, we're talking about a period of a couple of decades from now before we could even hope to see regulations that establish the kind of system that Americans can actually rely upon to protect them from unsafe drugs. We do not need, nor should we accept, this kind of delay. Development of technology to create unit-level electronic interoperable systems is well underway. If we institutionalize, that's what this bill would do, institutionalize the kinds of delays and uncertainties, will remove the incentive to continue this development and derail the good work that has gone into this effort thus far. The bill should be revised to ensure that we have a so-called phase 2, in which an electronic interoperable unit-level system is established at a reasonable date, certain, after enactment of the law. We should also not accept any legislation that requires the fate of this kind of system to hinge on promulgation of regulations by FDA. We should require FDA to act on the basis of the statutory text, which we have done repeatedly in the past. I just want to say very clearly to my colleagues, this legislation is not worth doing if we cannot tell the American public that we are confident it will lead to the establishment of a system that will actually protect them from unsafe drugs. What we would be doing is passing a bill that sounds like it's doing what the American people want, but the reality will be far different from that. I'd rather we pass no bill at all. I hope we can work together between today and when we have our full committee markup to make sure that the bill accomplishes these goals. That was the track we were on in bipartisan discussions last year. That's the track even the Senate is on as they consider this issue. Not that their proposal is fully to my qualifications of what needs to be done, but we are so far away from any bill that gets us to where we want to be that we've got to come to some further conclusion on this subject, and I hope my colleagues will work with us in good faith to accomplish that goal. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shump is recognized for 5 minutes.
Just strike last word. Just based upon the statements made already in this section, the local pharmacists are in town right now. I met with them last night, and it's always curious to hear my friends say they don't want the public to have access through the rulemaking and public comment, and that's what this bill allows us to do. I want my local pharmacists to be able to be part of this debate with the FDA and having a discussion on the rollout of this, to do a date certain and push it before everyone has a proper time to have that. I think is harmful and disruptive, and there's a lot of people who think the 2-year time frame is actually too short to begin with itself. So good people will be able to agree to disagree, and I think this is one that there will probably be disagreement on. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Any further discussion? Gentleman, Mr. Dingell's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I want to make a few comments here. And I say these things with great respect for both my two colleagues, Mr. Pallone and Mr. Waxman. The last perfect legislation was brought off Mount Sinai by a fellow by the name of Moses, written by the finger of God on 2 stone tablets. We haven't done so well since, and this Congress doesn't do particularly well. But as Woodrow Wilson one time observed, the Congress at work is in its committees. And I want to commend the 2 gentlemen I've just mentioned, but I also want to commend the chairman and the subcommittee chairman for their assistance and for their attitude. This bill is not perfect, and it is now in the process. I can't tell you how the process will come out, but I can tell you one thing for sure. If we don't let the process work, nothing is going to come out, and nothing good is going to come out. And so we have an opportunity here to work together to make this legislation better. There are defects in it. I agree. And even though I am one of the sponsors of it, I recognize that it has defects that we have to work on. And I intend to do so. I urge my colleagues, both sides, to work together. This Congress is not able to work well together and has not. This committee has done better than most, and it's done so because we have a tradition and because, frankly, we do work together and we have some small pride in that matter, and it's proper. So my suggestion to my colleagues is let's let the process work. Let's help it work. I know the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, has some amendments he wants to offer. I understand he also is probably going to withdraw them. But we can have a discussion of those matters, and the process can work together. I want to commend the chairman of the full committee and the staffs on both sides for the efforts that they've made in seeing to it that these things come together with what can potentially be a very major correction of the problems that exist at Food and Drug, remaining in spite of all the best efforts of this committee because of the mischief that occurred up in Massachusetts and in other things and in other places and times. Having said these things, let's work together. We have much to do here, and making people safe and working with the industry and pointing out the virtues and the strengths and the weaknesses of the legislation is one of the functions that we can all participate in as we move forward to finish the legislation and come up with something of which this committee, all members on both sides, can be reasonably proud and pleased about what we have done in terms of protecting the people.
Will the gentleman yield to me?
I'll be happy to yield to you.
I certainly concur in your sentiments that we continue to talk, and we may not be able to reach the level of perfection that Moses accomplished on Mount Sinai, but there are things we can do. But I wanted to answer the point raised by Mr. Shimkus in case there are any pharmacists or other stakeholders in the audience. We don't want to stop the FDA from getting the input from the stakeholders. The FDA will issue, of course, guidance and standards and meet with the stakeholders, but the FDA, the way the bill is structured, nothing happens until the FDA acts. And in the past, we've always said, this is what we expect from the FDA. We want them to accomplish the goals and then set the process in motion, not say after the process is in motion and after it's completed, will we ever get any result to get an interoperable
my time is expiring, and I want to say to the gentleman that there's much truth in what he says, but we can't get to the point where we're going to have at least the ability to say that we have worked on a good piece of legislation, we've made changes by working together, unless we commence doing that. And I'm anxious to see that the gentleman has the opportunity to do so, and I'm sure everybody else on this committee is anxious to see that that happens too. So my suggestion, my prayer to my colleagues is, let's work together on this. I think there's real promise, and if we don't work together on this, I can guarantee either no bill or a bad bill. And this committee has a long record of writing good legislation patiently after a long period of trouble, trial, and fighting. And I'm willing to undergo that process and to urge my colleagues who remember the great days of this committee to do those things so that we can come up with something of which we can be proud. I yield back to balance.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Does anyone else seek recognition? The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and colleagues, I move to strike the last word. Chairman and colleagues, I appreciate greatly the work that has been done on a bipartisan basis on this effort. However, the bill before us has a flaw that needs to be addressed before we hear the bill in the full committee, and that is we need to ensure that existing state and federal laws relating to pedigree information are not preempted until the new pedigree requirement is fully implemented, which will be no later than July 1, 2015. And here's what has happened. In the face of the limited federal requirements relating to counterfeit drugs, some states, like my home state of Florida, have stepped in and enacted their own laws to require the tracking and tracing of pharmaceuticals. Florida passed such a law in 2003. It was signed by Governor Jeb Bush. It has been in operation since then, and it has worked well for 10 years. I believe that our colleague, Congressman Gus Bilirakis, was in the legislature and probably had a hand in the formulation of that policy, and it has worked very well. Florida law requires that a pedigree that identifies each previous sale of a drug back to the manufacturer accompany most drug transactions. This is smart, and it has really helped us address a counterfeiting and diverted drug problem in the state of Florida, and I think that's the overriding intent of the legislation before us today. Florida is not the only state that has acted to legislate in this area. According to the Healthcare Distribution Management Association, there are 18 states that have adopted final rules on pedigree. The bill we are considering today would preempt all of these state laws on the date of enactment. And that's problematic because then you'll have all of these good state regulations that will die on that day rather than come to an end when the federal law is fully operational. It would also avoid current federal requirements that were set forth in Section 503 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act as part of the Prescription Drug Marketing Act of 1987. Now, when we heard Dr. Janet Woodcock of the FDA here 2 weeks ago, her overriding concern with the draft legislation was that it would eliminate the existing pedigree requirements before we've replaced them with the new and improved system. And she urged us to address that flaw in the legislation. My neighbors in Florida have come to rely on the strong wholesaler licensing standards and the existing pedigree regulations that Florida already has on the books to protect them from counterfeit medications. And we need to address this in this bill, that Florida and states with similar laws can keep their standards in place until new pedigree requirements are fully phased in. Otherwise, there would be too much gray area, too much uncertainty, wasted tax dollars at issue. And I think here we all want the same end goal, to ensure our pharmaceutical supply chain is safe, ensuring states with existing pedigree standards can keep them in place until 2005 would be an important bridge to make this an effective effort. So I'd like to inquire of the chair and the co-sponsors today, ask them if they would be willing to work with me between today and next week's full committee markup to make this, to address this flaw in the bill and to make some improvements.
Generally yield to me?
I yield to
well, I certainly think we ought to work on this problem, and I share your concerns with regard to preempting existing state or federal law requiring a passage of pedigree information identifying a drug's transaction history. If we preempted all the laws until we get something in place maybe 20 years from now, we'll be eliminating a safeguard and putting nothing in place for at least a year and a half, maybe longer. The FDA's director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research made this point at the hearing. I can understand there may be different opinions about how strong a federal system needs to be before it should preempt state law, but certainly we all ought to agree that existing pedigree requirements should stay in place at least until the bill's new pedigree requirements are in effect. Otherwise, what we'll be doing is creating a window of opportunity for counterfeiters and other traffickers in illicit prescription drugs. So I hope we, along with your request, we'll all work together between today and the full committee markup to make what I consider to be essentially a technical fix to this component of the bill. Thank you for yielding to me.
Chair thanks the gentlelady, and we will commit to continuing the discussion with you. We won't make any promises. We're trying to eliminate duplication, not create it.
The gentleman,
Chair recognizes.
Just say we're more than happy, certainly, to work and listen. I'm concerned a little bit about the burden on small pharmacies, but between now and the markup, we'll be glad to entertain what suggestions you have and see what happens. Thank you.
Does anyone else seek recognition? Gentlemen, the ranking members recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to respond also by saying that I hope that we can address this concern that the gentlewoman from Florida has raised when we get to full, or between now and when we get to full committee, because I am extremely concerned that under the legislation before us today, existing state pedigrees would be immediately wiped out without a new pedigree requirement in place. And not only would the bill preempt state pedigree from day one of the enactment, it would also invalidate current federal requirements in Section 503E of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And as we've heard, in the absence of strong federal standards, some states have enacted their own laws to address the issue of the security of the pharmaceutical supply chain, and a number of states have adopted final rules on the topic. So we should work to ensure that no existing laws requiring passage of pedigree information are preempted until the federal requirements under the track and trace legislation are fully implemented. Under the bill we are considering today, the requirements would be fully implemented no later than July 1st, 2015. At our legislative hearing a couple weeks ago, even the FDA witness, Dr. Janet Woodcock, indicated that we should not eliminate existing pedigree requirements until they are replaced with a new system. It seems to me only logical that existing state and federal pedigree requirements stay in effect until the new requirements are fully in effect. So again, I commend the gentlewoman from Florida for raising this issue, and let's hope we can address it before we get to full committee. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Does anyone else seek recognition? The gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, recognized for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word. While I understand the urgency toward creation of a national track and trace standard, I'm incredibly concerned that the bill before us would take away protection that some states have already enacted to protect the supply chain and consumers. This is clear in looking at the Phase 2 implementation timeline. This timeline delays the protections promised to my home state of California for at least 15 years without any indication as to why that time frame was chosen. The bill would also harm local protections in smaller ways as well, especially in terms of wholesale licensure. The bill we are considering would require FDA to set national standards for the state licensure of wholesale distributors. And I think we all agree that this is an important provision. And I agree that it is important to ensure that all states have minimum wholesale licensure requirements. However, despite the concern I raised at last week's hearing, the bill before us would prevent states from imposing any additional licensure requirements on wholesaler. This would prevent state agencies from addressing new issues as they arise in their states or adapt requirements to meet specific needs of their individual states. I believe the bill should preserve the ability of states to enact stronger licensure requirements so they can address state-specific issues that may arise. It's really a states' rights issue. For example, because California has 500 wholesale distributors, it needs to have an extremely efficient system for assessing their compliance with licensure requirements. One mechanism it does use is to require wholesalers to annually fill out and maintain a self-assessment of their compliance with licensure requirements. This aids the wholesalers in ensuring that their own compliance is accurate and aids state inspectors in monitoring that compliance. States with few wholesale distributors may not need such a mechanism, but California would lose this kind of flexibility if the bill before us is adopted. Another California requirement is that wholesale distributors report sales of certain controlled substance drugs when such sales to any one pharmacy are above a certain threshold. This aids California in identifying potentially high-risk pharmacies that may warrant further attention. This provision was added not by the federal government, but by the state in response to identified public safety needs. But if this bill again becomes law, this California protection could be lost. The bottom line is that some states have acted to protect their constituents and their businesses, and California, I think because of our size and other issues, has been a leader in this respect. We have to allow for the flexibility of these states to ensure a safe drug supply and continue their working systems. It's the approach that the bipartisan Senate bill has taken. It should be the same approach that we take here in the House. So I hope we can work together between today and full committee markup so that the FDA federal licensure requirements in the bill will be a floor, but not a ceiling, for state licensure of wholesale distributors. It's a small, but I think very critical step to keeping our communities safe and protecting local states. And I have some time. I see two people interested. I'll yield to my chair.
Thank you very much for yielding. I agree with you that the bill's wholesale licensure provision needs to be revised. It's important to preserve the ability of states to enact stronger licensure requirements than those FDA might impose, so that they can address issues that might arise that are unique or specific to their states. For example, California is considering a requirement that would ban wholesale distributors from purchasing drugs from pharmacies other than returns of drugs they had sold to an individual pharmacy. California found that some secondary wholesalers and pharmacies were colluding in obtaining shortage drugs from primary wholesalers and reselling them to clinics and hospitals at huge markups. California was able to take action against the local pharmacies participating in these activities. However, wholesalers then began soliciting out-of-state pharmacies to participate in the same types of activities. California is therefore considering new legislation to prohibit wholesalers from purchasing drugs from pharmacies other than returns. This is an issue that FDA might ultimately want to include in a federal requirement, but I don't believe that California or any other state should be precluded from imposing it in the interim. Thus, I hope we can work together between today and next week's markup on this issue. When Moses came down with the tablets, he only preempted the tribes when he had perfection. We shouldn't preempt the states to act in the absence of, forgive me, Mr. Chairman, a couple seconds more, in the absence of not just perfection but the good. And this bill is not good enough, so I hope we can work it out. Thank you for yielding.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Does anyone else seek recognition?
I just wanted to add, if I could, I'm sorry my time has run out, but I wanted to ask unanimous consent to insert 2 letters for the record signed by 19 groups, including the American Public Health Association, the National Association of Health Authorities, the Pancreatic Cancer Network, and National Researchers for Women.
Without objection, so ordered. Anyone else seeking recognition?
Chairman.
The gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to submit some comments from from Pew Charitable Trust for the record. They've worked for a long time on this issue on a bipartisan basis, and these comments that I would like to submit for the record, I think that's been agreed to, offer sensible recommendations to improve the bill. For example, Pew recommends that the electronic unit-level traceability system be self-effectuating so that it is not dependent upon FDA issuing regulations. Otherwise, the system may never be put in place, and it recommends that the system be in effect in 7 years, not in 2029, as the current draft envisions.
Without objection, so ordered.
I ask the gentlewoman to yield to me.
I'd be happy to yield.
Thank you. When I listen, this isn't the reason I asked for the time, but Mr. Waxman and Mr. Dingell's comments from the Bible and Moses made me think of how we miss Mr. Markey, because Ed would always give us all the Latin and other phrases. So maybe we'll have to make up for that now that he's not around anymore and kind of think of our own biblical or Latin or Greek phrases. But I just wanted to support what Mr. Waxman said about Ms. Capps with regard to the federal wholesale distributor licensure requirements. I think that, federal wholesale distributor licensure requirements should act as a floor and not as a floor and a ceiling. The bill before us today requires FDA to set national standards for the state licensure of wholesale distributors, and this is critical to ensure that all states have minimum licensure requirements. However, the bill also prevents states from setting additional licensure requirements for wholesalers in their state, and this is very concerning. State-specific issues may arise that under this version of the bill, states would not be able to address. By preventing states from establishing requirements above the federal standard, we would be tying states' hands and preventing them from adopting new requirements or adapting requirements to meet the unique needs of their state. And we should pass legislation that sets minimum federal standards, but also allows states to enact stronger licensure requirements so that they can respond to state-specific needs as they see fit. So, again, I would ask that between now and full committee that we try to address Ms. Capps' concerns because I think that they need to be addressed, frankly, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield for one?
It's Ms. Schakowsky's time.
Would you yield to me, please? And I'll be quick. This is right in the sweet spot of our Energy and Commerce Committee. This is interstate commerce, and if we move down the route to 50 different standards, we will not have a bill. We just will not have a bill, and that's the fact. The whole debate is how do you get a national standard for interstate commerce, and I would caution us if we go down the route of not making this the ceiling but the floor and allowing states to add on, there will not be a national bill, and I thank you for yielding.
Yeah. Anyone else seeking recognition?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Engels, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for yielding me time. I remain concerned about the discussion draft before us because it lacks a definite date for the full implementation of an electronic interoperable unit-level track and track system. However, I'd like to see a uniform national standard be passed into law by this Congress. So I hope that my Republican colleagues in the House will work with this side, the Democrats, to improve this bill before the full committee markup. I really hope that happens. I yield back time unless anyone wants my...
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Anyone else?
I yield to Mr. Waxman.
Mr. Waxman.
I thank you for yielding. There's a difference between a floor and a ceiling. A floor means that every state's going to have the minimum, but states ought to be able to act to unique problems in that state. And we need to recognize that reality. And when it comes to returns, it can create a significant loophole for the potential entry of illegitimate products into the prescription drug supply chain. For example, pharmacies could obtain counterfeit or substandard medicines and sell them back to the wholesaler at a profit, and then the wholesaler could redistribute that product into the supply chain. This bill should be revised to clarify that if wholesalers decide to distribute returned drug products, they must provide a transaction history along with it. The current bill appears to intend to impose such a requirement, but its wording could be open to other interpretations. The bill should be revised to require that the transaction history include a notation that the drug product is a return, so that the recipient will know why the transaction history begins with the wholesaler and does not refer back to the manufacturer or to an entity that received the drug product from the manufacturer. And the bill should be revised so that 1 year after enactment, wholesalers would have to associate the return product with the applicable transaction history and transaction statement before distributing returned drug product. The transaction history would not have to include transaction dates if they were not reasonably obtainable. Such a requirement would ensure that the wholesaler checks to see that the returned product from the dispenser was indeed the product that the wholesaler sold to that dispenser. As a result, the likelihood of a counterfeit or substandard product entering the supply chain would be diminished. So I hope we can work together between today and the full committee markup to make these improvements in the bill. There is a difference between a floor and a ceiling, and I think that there are some times that states have unique problems, and they ought to be able to act. And this is an area where that concern clearly is raised in my mind.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Mr. Engel, it's still your time. Anyone else seek recognition? If not, the question now occurs on forwarding the committee print to the full committee as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation approved by the subcommittee today. So ordered. Without objection, subcommittee stands adjourned.